Hi, everyone. This is Ria. Welcome back to On the Brink. In this episode, I sat down with Rowan Stone, who leads business development at Base, the L2 that Coinbase launched earlier this year. In this episode, Rowan expands on the role of business development in growing an L2 ecosystem, why Coinbase decided to build Base using the OP stack, and his views on Optimism's Superchain vision, the use cases that Rowan is especially excited about across DeFi, loyalty, and the creator economy, Web3 social, and so on, the vectors of centralization in L2s today, and the proposed path to decentralization, and more. Here's my conversation with Rowan.
Matt Walsh and Nick Carter are partners at Castle Island Ventures. All views expressed by them or the guests on this podcast are solely their opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Castle Island Ventures. Guests and hosts may maintain positions in the assets discussed in this podcast. You should not treat any opinion expressed by anyone on this podcast as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or follow a particular strategy, but only as an expression of their personal opinion. This podcast is for informational purposes only.
Brought down by bad mortgage investments, Lehman, which has 25,000 employees, will be liquidated.
The federal government loans American International Group, AIG, $85 billion.
This is a different kind of market, and the Fed is asleep.
The federal government is stepping in to stabilize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two mortgage giants that have been threatened by the housing crisis.
The Bank of England has pumped £75 billion more into Britain's ailing economy with a new round of quantitative easing.
You print a couple $1 trillion, and all of a sudden, people start to worry. So out of this worry, we have something called a Bitcoin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of On the Brink. This is Ria from Castle Island Ventures, and I'm joined today by Rowan Stone, who is the head of BD at Base. Rowan, great to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe to start off, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you were working on prior to Base and what ultimately led you to Base, and what does a head of BD for Base look like?
Happy to. So I've been in the crypto space for quite a long time, been specifically at Coinbase for a couple of years now. And my role really is heading up what we call the Onchain BD team. So we look after partnerships and initiatives and growth efforts across a bunch of different verticals, things like DeFi and social and governance and gaming and infrastructure, and obviously the creator space, which is super popular and growing really quickly. And we also look after some of the specific Coinbase products. So we help on the business side with things like USDC, Coinbase Wrapped ETH, and I serve as the business and operations lead for Base, Coinbase's layer 2. And what does it look like? We are aiming to bring 1 million builders and 1 billion users on chain as quickly as we possibly can. And to make that happen, we really need to make on-chain as affordable and as useful as possible. And we need to build the best possible developer environment to start getting people to actually engage and build. And so a big part of our role, at least for just now, is starting to pad out a minimally viable ecosystem and start to make transacting and operating on Base fun and useful. So that's where we've been focusing most of our time and attention over the past 6 to 12 months.
Got it. While we're on this topic of what business development for Base looks like, how is it different in your perspective from what business development and growth for a traditional company looks like?
Great question. I think the biggest difference here is the fact that Base is completely open, completely permissionless, and although centralized as a Coinbase product, aiming to decentralize as quickly as possible. And that makes it a little bit unique in terms of how we grow. And one of the main differentiators, for example, if we compare versus a standard Coinbase product, be that like Exchange or any other part of the business, we are moving slowly and we are engaging with regulators and we are doing things in a compliant, methodical way. And so entering a new market takes significant effort, significant time, lots of strategic positioning. And once we have all the pieces in place, we have the right fiat rails and we have the right licensing and all that kind of thing, then we can start to roll out. Whereas Base is inherently open and global. And so we can approach things in a completely different way. We can be much broader to start with, and we can figure out in which geographies really we're starting to see traction. And from there, start to double down in those areas. So a very different approach. But beyond that, it's very builder focused. It's first and foremost a infrastructure layer and really a layer that we want builders to come and use. Our aim is to be just the natural spot for builders to build. And the positioning here, our thesis, our hope is that if we can provide good distribution and provide the right tooling and provide affordable and reliable block space, we're going to be able to have builders come and just start to deploy their applications here. And obviously, the more dApps, the more utility, the more chance we have of gaining adoption. And that's really the driver we're trying to push here.
So you mentioned that one of the goals is to onboard the next million builders onto Base, Onchain, into crypto. How do you think about creating an environment that makes it much easier for them to build and operate relative to maybe what existed pre-Base or what existed pre-L2s more broadly?
Yeah, I think for me, the two primary friction points that exist, at least in my mind, are preventing us really meaningfully pushing forward as an industry and getting more adoption. That crypto is still way too expensive, broadly. And we're doing a lot of work in that space. L2s are firmly in the bucket of how do we collapse transaction costs and how do we get to a point where block space is just a commodity that's reliable and affordable and easy to get access to. The other big friction is that this stuff is still hugely complicated. And it's not just hugely complicated from a user perspective, it's hugely complicated to build on. And if a developer's got a cool idea, there's so many questions they need to answer before they can even start to write code and start to deploy that cool idea. Where do I build? How do I build? What's the right methodology? There's just tons of things that we'll need to think about. And for me, a big part of that problem is that as an industry, we've been off building in 50 different directions for the past decade or so. And we've made a ton of progress. There are more and more cool things to be done on chain every single day. But ultimately, if you're knocking on your neighbor's door and trying to show them the top 10 coolest dApps that are available right now, the chances are they're on 5 or 6 different chains. And that means that your neighbor needs to have 5 or 6 different block explorers to see their transactions in these different places. And they may need to use multiple wallets. They may have to use 2 or 3 wallets. And so if we're wanting to bring 1 billion users and 1 million builders on chain, these types of things need to be fixed. And so we're not solving this. We're trying to take a step in the right direction and urge people to start thinking a little bit differently. But the reason, or one of the big reasons that we chose to build on OP Stack is that it's an open standard for layer 2. And because it's open, because it's permissionless, because it's MIT licensed, we can accelerate the development of that tech stack and then encourage others to build on it. And the idea here is that rather than building in 50 different directions, we try and get some central mass to build in a particular way so that we can start having interoperability between a bunch of these different chains. And the thinking here is that we don't expect the future to be one big chain to rule them all. Much more likely there's going to be tens, hundreds even of different chains that come together to collectively scale in lots of different verticals. Maybe they'll be specialized, there'll be something for creators, something for gaming, et cetera, et cetera. And so these things need to be able to talk to provide a good user experience and a good builder experience. So the hope is that by taking a step forward in that realm and trying to build towards this superchain vision that Optimism has, we're encouraging people to start doing the same.
Understood. From the outside in, it seems as if Base is a general purpose L2 built using the OP stack. Is the right way to think about Base as a general purpose L2, or are there specific categories of applications that you're trying to attract and specialize in on top of Base? And in the last 2.5 to 3 months since Base has launched, has there been a specific category of applications that has really taken off relative to others?
So the first thing I need to say is kind of almost turning into somewhat of a tagline, and that is that Base is for everyone. And I think that's really important. We can't trumpet the global, decentralized, open, permissionless type sentence if we then say, oh, but by the way, it's for this. So no, Base really is aiming to be a general purpose builder platform. And we want to attract developers that have ideas in lots of different verticals. For sure, certain verticals are further ahead in the adoption curve than others. there's better product market fit in certain areas than others. DeFi, clearly, the first time that as a space, as an industry, we have real product market fit. We've built this incredible new system that enables anyone anywhere to have access to things that they wouldn't have had access to previously. We're also seeing a ton of traction in the creator realm, empowering creators to better own and distribute and remove layers of complexity and connect directly with their audiences. Tons of cool stuff happening there. Onchain Summer, which I'm sure we can talk about in a bit, was like a great demonstration of what's possible in that realm. But I think speaking specifically about Base and thinking about what's had good traction so far, we can't not talk about FriendTech. They've just crushed it. They created something pretty unique, very unique actually. And they've enabled people to start to monetize their social following. And they've enabled individuals who want access to particular people to have that direct connection. It's been driving a ton of volume, a ton of transaction, a ton of excitement. I think in the first maybe week or two of them launching, they pretty much had the entire of crypto Twitter in and actively using. So they're building fast, they're iterating quickly. Every time I log into that app, there's something new. The UI's changed a little bit or some feature's been added that makes it a little bit slicker. Super cool to see. And definitely, for me, the thing that stands out as having most traction so far.
Out of curiosity, how did FriendTech's decision to build on Base come about? Was that a function of you actively, if you're able to share, talking to the team and courting them to Base? Or was it more of a, hey, we think that for all of these reasons, Base is the most compelling option, so we're going to make the active decision to build on Base? Would love to get your thoughts on that.
It wasn't us courting in any way, shape, or form. I think we did a pretty good job during testnet and during run up to mainnet of gathering some excitement and some attention from the broader community and ensuring that it was well understood what our principles were and what we're trying to achieve and what Base is all about. And so L2 block space essentially at this point is a commodity. We differentiate with distribution and by trying to position ourselves as the best possible environment for builders. And so they were attracted to that. They're aligned with what we're trying to do. They clearly want distribution because it's really important for a social app in the early days to have access to lots and lots of eyeballs. And so I guess they were attracted to Base for those reasons.
Understood. Beyond FriendTech, what other applications and use cases have you seen in the early days on Base that you're most excited about?
I think Blackbird's the other one that's really cool, and I believe in your back garden. So they are building a loyalty type application for restaurants. You scan an NFC chip at the door, immediately recognizes who you are, and then restaurants can start layering in rewards, but also better understanding their customers and customer behaviors and all that kind of cool stuff. They've deployed on Base. They're growing pretty quickly. I think they have somewhere between 15, maybe 20 restaurants now. I believe all of which are in New York. Bummer for me, down in Panama. But super cool to see, and something that I think we're going to see more and more of. It just makes sense. There's certain use cases for blockchain tech that just are a natural fit, and loyalty for me is one of those that is a bit of a no-brainer. So cool to see them build.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's a use case that I'm surprised hasn't existed until now. It just seems like such a natural implementation on top of on-chain rails. So I'm super excited to see them continuing to expand the number of restaurants that they're working with. And I'm excited to see what happens once they have a critical mass of restaurants and users that are using this unified platform to manage their loyalty across the board. So I'm super excited about that one as well. I want to take a step back and just talk about Coinbase's decision to architect an L2. What was the rationale? And you spoke to this a little bit, but maybe we can have a more comprehensive discussion around the benefits of having the L2 being a part of Coinbase's ecosystem.
For us, Coinbase is a really large crypto company. However, Coinbase, although generating tons and tons of transactions and clearly operating on chain every single day, it's still very much a big centralized entity. And really, if we think about how that business has been built over the past decade, it's gotten really good at the fiat to crypto piece. operating as a bridge to bring people from the fiat world into the crypto world, perhaps for the first time, perhaps they're seasoned, they've been around for a while, either way. And thinking about where crypto goes from here, it's very obvious that people are going to be transacting more and more on-chain. And we want to ensure that we are an active part of that kind of development of the space, continuing to operate as a bridge. And this time, instead of bridging from fiat to crypto, we bridge from crypto centralized within Coinbase to having people actually owning their own funds, having an identity on chain, minting things, creating things themselves, playing on-chain games, just exploring that world that's unfolding super, super quickly. And if we take a step back for a second and think about why we chose to deploy a chain of our own, it's really that, and I talked to this a little bit before, we don't believe in a future where there's one big chain. We reckon there's going to be a whole bunch of chains. And in a world where there's a whole bunch of chains, and ideally all of these chains can communicate together, or like meaningful segments of the market can interoperate, it makes sense for us to have a chain of our own and us to actively participate in that space. As a business, we have a very large number of very sharp, very sophisticated engineers who have been in the space for a long time. And so we're really well equipped to actively lean in and try and help drive progress, try and help with decentralization, try and help with improved security, lots of different methodologies, speed, security, whatever. And so decision was made actually quite a number of years ago to explore. And at the time, the moons didn't quite align. Like, it just didn't quite make sense. The original exploration was, should Coinbase have a layer 1 blockchain? And the ultimate output was probably not. It's going to be siloed. It's going to be difficult to connect other places. That was revisited a couple of times over the years. And this most recent time went through the full exploration of, okay, we know we want to do this. We want to give Coinbase engineers a place, a home in the on-chain world that they can start building. Layer 1 clearly is not going to scale enough in most cases, like some layer 1s will. But then unfortunately, the layer 1s that can scale a decent amount aren't connected to the rest of the ecosystem. And so we didn't want to be isolated on an island. We very much wanted to be part of the very quickly growing ecosystem that is Ethereum. And so building a layer 2 and helping to scale Ethereum alongside everybody else building on layer 2 just seemed to be the natural choice. And then we really centered on Optimism, and I mentioned this previously, because A, we get on really well with the team, and it's important that we're building alongside people that kind of have a similar mentality, believe in the same types of things as us. And B, the tech stack is modular, which means that we can do a whole bunch of cool things that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And then C, most importantly to me, it's fully open source and MIT licensed, which means that anybody anywhere can actively lean in and participate. And it means that we can actually build in community, which we believe is the right way to be progressing.
Absolutely. As I think about the value proposition for Coinbase in having this on-chain and off-chain component, I analogize it to the way that Apple has made it so seamless to move across devices and across very critical applications within the Apple ecosystem to the point where the end user doesn't think about it. And hopefully through this, we get to an experience where people don't think about moving on and off chain. And I think the industry broadly is making progress in that direction. So that's super exciting to see.
For sure. There's a couple of products actually, or a couple of tech stacks, if you like, that really help move the needle there. One thing that Coinbase has been working on and using for quite a long time is MPC, or multi-party computation type tech for wallets. And the first deployment of that is just enabling a user in Coinbase.com to spin up what we had labeled as a Web3 wallet and quite quickly be transacting on chain. We don't need to worry about complexities of storing keys or backing up a seed phrase. We shard the key at our side. We have a copy. It's all good. But the key is that within a couple of clicks, they're ready with a wallet. They can move a balance from Coinbase directly into it. And the next click would be on Uniswap doing a trade, or on Aave, or minting an NFT on OpenSea, whatever it ends up being, just bridging that gap between centralized off-chain and on-chain. And then the other big unlock, I think, just tons, but another big one that comes to mind is account abstraction. And that is a tech stack that's being built out pretty quickly with smart contract wallets and all that kind of thing. Enabling dApps to remove gas from the equation is going to be a massive unlock. And just that simple thing from a user onboarding perspective, and I think Friendtech's actually a great example here. They did it pretty well. there's huge friction there. If you want to open a dApp for the first time and you don't have a wallet and you're not funded, you're in a world of pain. Even with the slick Coinbase onboarding and things like that, it's still going to be a world of pain. It's going to take you a little bit of time to fund your wallet and to get up to speed and get ready. Whereas with account abstraction and enabling gasless transactions, which for anyone listening that's not aware, it's just basically the dApp funding the gas on behalf of the user, the back-end infrastructure that enables that to work in a really slick way. It just means that the user's in and they're transacting really quickly. So from an onboarding perspective, it's going to really grease the wheels. And I think the last thing, going off on a tangent here, but while we're talking about things that are going to be major unlocks, I think the other one that's top of mind for me just now is identity. I say that because it's really hard to figure out who owns a particular wallet. Obviously, a wallet address is pseudonymous. And if you are a DeFi protocol, or if you are, I don't know, a lender of some sort, and you want to lend to a user, at the moment, you're going to want them to over-collateralize. And that's a fairly large area of friction that's stopping normal users wanting to lean in and use what's available. So I think unlocking identity is going to be one of these watershed moments where we realize, wow, there's a ton of new cool stuff that we can now do because we know that this address is owned by Rowan and he's here and this is his credit rating or this is his trust or whatever the question may be. So super excited on that front. And I think we're seeing a number of really cool companies building at breakneck speed, trying to plug that gap.
I agree with all of those things. I think being able to use things like MPC and account abstraction to make the process of onboarding and transacting on chain much more seamless is a massive unlock. I think I saw a dashboard by someone named Kofi on Twitter on the number of smart contract wallets on Base, and it was a non-trivial amount. So that's really cool to see. And yeah, to your point, being able to do things like gasless transactions and not having to authorize each and every small action. For example, if you're playing an on-chain game, you don't want to have to click into your wallet to authorize each and every transaction that you're doing within the game. That's a huge unlock. And yeah, lastly on identity, definitely an unsolved problem, but it's definitely, I feel like we're starting to make progress on that as an industry. Bridging identity and reputation and on and off chain context is super important. You guys were obviously very thoughtful in deciding to build an L2 and to specifically build an L2 in the Optimism ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit about how did the Base team work with the Optimism team leading up to Base mainnet? And then how are you continuing to work with Optimism and contribute to that ecosystem? Because I know that there's a number of different ways that you guys are supporting each other.
I think probably the biggest project, if you like, or scope that we've worked on together pre-Base is something called EP.483. And we talked before, Base is essentially a giant aggregator of transactions that enables us to have economies of scale, just a standard L2. And so it collapses transactions from the 5, 10, 100 buck mark that we saw for layer 1 during the last bull market down to 5 to 10 cents generally. But that's still way too expensive for the majority of mass market use cases. And so we need to find a way to scale all layer 2s. And EIP4844, for anyone unaware, is essentially carving out dedicated block space, which is actually called blob space. Gotta love Ethereum names. Blob space is a pretty cool word. It's carving out blob space on layer 1. And that's a dedicated spot that gives layer 2s like Optimism mainnet and Arbitrum and Base some level of certainty in terms of what the pricing for publishing back to layer 1 is going to be, but it also gives some dedicated capacity. And so that enables us to collapse transaction fees on OP mainnet and Base and Arbitrum by a pretty decent margin. We're looking at 2 to 5x, something like that in the short term. And then every quarter thereafter, there's an ability for us to expand that blob space a little bit further and so collapse transactions a little bit more. This is ultimately aiming for sub 1 cent transactions on layer 2 and some level of smoothing out of the transaction price curve. Because right now, even on layer 2, in times of, let's just use bull as the example, in a bull market, you're going to have big fluctuations in gas costs. It's going to go from 10 to maybe 15, 20 cents and then back down to 5. So we want to get to a point where we are fractions of a cent up to a cent type deal. That's the aim there. And that's an effort that we worked hand in hand with both Optimism and Arbitrum. And that's partly what gave us the confidence to lean in with Optimism. Working with our team was awesome. They're very sharp, very technically savvy, and they're building a direction that we agree with.
Going back to this idea of just BD and growth and success of the Base ecosystem, can you speak to how you guys are thinking about funding, either from a venture capital perspective or a grants perspective, to grow the ecosystem and support projects, both financially as well as through the Base team and the Coinbase team in achieving success on Base?
Grants is something that is top of mind. We are asked on a hourly basis, not even a daily basis, what we're doing in the grant space. We started off quite slowly and very methodically, and trying to start small, see what works. So we partnered or worked closely with the team at NounsDAO and PropHouse to spin up a very simple prescriptive grants program there. And that enables individual builders and small entities to deploy something cool in a variety of different verticals and then be rewarded for that thing. We're now moving into a more generalized grant space. These are still going to be much lower value, much more modest, trying to be very targeted. The idea here is not you have a dApp on 3 different chains and you want $500,000 to deploy on a new one. The idea is very much you're an individual developer and you've got a cool idea to make, I don't know, a decentralized Oracle or something. And it's going to take 6 months of your life to deploy this. And so we issue a grant to cover that time and inspire that open source contribution. So that's where we are today. We're also working with Optimism on this front. So the next round of retroactive public goods funding is currently open, and builders on Base are eligible for that round. So if somebody's building on Base and they want to apply for funding, they can do that through the normal portal on Optimism Governance. Moving forward, funding-wise, we obviously have Coinbase Ventures within the group, and they are operating something called the Base Ecosystem Fund, and that exists to ensure that there is some capital for seed or pre-seed and early stage builders that want to build cool things on Base. And they've made a number of investments so far, and there's a number of really cool groups coming together to deploy tech on Base, which is awesome to see.
I think a good follow-up question for that might be, are there any requests for products that you guys have that you're hoping for people to build on Base?
Absolutely. Brian Armstrong actually wrote a blog post not too long ago about some of the things that he was super excited to see being deployed on-chain, just on-chain broadly, Base or otherwise. And they were things like identity solutions, which we all know is super important for unlocking utility. There's also things like flat coins. So stable coins have driven huge amounts of utility to lots and lots of people around the world. Flat coins are kind of like the next iteration potentially of that. We don't fully know if there's tons of demand, but theoretically they make a ton of sense. And the idea there is to have a coin that's inflation adjusted. So it maintains some stable store of value. So rather than being pegged to $1, it's pegged to some unit of account. Pretty cool. There was also a recent ecosystem summit where Brian and Jesse and a number of other people hosted a ton of cool builders across the space and tried to mentor and inspire and just help generally anybody who's looking to build in a variety of these different verticals. And that was in collaboration with the ventures team, who are obviously writing checks and making investments in some of the companies that come through these. So really cool to see, and something that we're going to be doubling down on. We'll be a lot more active in the grant space, working closely with Optimism, but also diverting some of our own sequencer revenues to ensure that we're funding builders and bringing people, empowering people, and getting them to build cool things on chain.
Absolutely. So another thing you mentioned is retroactive public goods funding. Just to level set for the audience, could you explain what exactly that means?
So there's 2 ways to fund and inspire growth and reward contributions. We've seen both in the market. One way is to issue a grant upfront and hope that the person you're issuing the grant to delivers something of value. Now, clearly that's a little bit of a gamble. The other way of doing it is to simply issue grants to the builders retrospectively that have already delivered value. So the idea of retroactive public goods funding is to look at the ecosystem and say, such and such has delivered a ton of value here. We're going to send a grant to reward them for their contributions. I think one obvious call out here, Zach XBT is one of the recipients of a grant relatively recently. I think it was in the last round of Optimism, retroactive public goods funding. And the idea there is he's just someone we need to have around. He's doing work that somebody needs to do to try and clean up this space in some way, shape, or form. And the community felt that he should be rewarded for those contributions, and therefore a grant was issued. More specifically, it's typically about, have you driven growth in users, or have you driven cool utility, or have you increased the value locked in a particular network? If so, we want to reward you for that contribution.
Definitely. That's super helpful. Thanks for going over that. Another thing that you've mentioned a few times is just the decentralization of Base. And I think that's a really important topic. I think before we dive into how you're thinking about decentralizing over time, it would be helpful maybe for listeners to understand what are the vectors of centralization on Base or L2s within the Optimism stack more broadly.
The primary vector here is the sequencer itself. So L2s rely upon a sequencer to essentially process transactions. And right now, all transactions on Base are processed by a single sequencer, which is operated by Coinbase. Now, there's a ton of other vectors. There's like ownership of keys and control of the challenger role and a variety of other different things that we could get into. But I think the primary vector by far is this single sequencer. And so a big part of our decentralization roadmap is to move away from Coinbase being the sole sequencer and move into a world where that function is somewhat decentralized. And it will very likely be a crawl, walk, run type environment where it'll initially be a small number of parties that are sharing sequencing. And then ultimately the vision is to try to get to a decentralized sequencing layer whereby anybody can participate in that and be rewarded for their contribution for doing so. So that's a really big part of the decentralization roadmap. And to be clear, like I say, currently Coinbase is the single sequencer, but we're aiming to move away from that as quickly as we can. The other part is who controls the ability to upgrade the network. And what I mean by that is who holds the keys. So who can make a change to the underlying smart contracts. And we have focused on this as our first area of decentralization. And so there's been a number of blog posts talking about this. But the aim here is to share the keys with Optimism, and then eventually move to a completely decentralized upgrade type ability. So there's a couple of governing pieces here. The first one is essentially communicating how Optimism and the Superchain intend to operate from a governance perspective, what's important. And that document or that thesis is called the Law of Chains. That's been socialized through OP governance. And that really just states what users can expect, what chain operators can expect, what dApps can expect in terms of how things will be run. And then the second big piece is currently in discussion, but this is essentially moving to a group, a large multi-signer group, which will have control over technical upgrades for the chains within the Superchain. And the reason for, I say centralizing, it really shouldn't be saying centralizing, but pooling the upgradability for a variety of chains into a decentralized structure, but one decentralized structure, is to ensure that these chains all stay at technical parity. And the reason for that is if we end up with just all chains in the Superchain going off in 50 different directions, we haven't solved that core problem of interoperability. While they're all in technical parity, it's going to be significantly easier for us to enable those chains to communicate properly. So quick recap, because I did a bit of ramble there. The first part of decentralization for us is decentralizing control of the blockchain itself so that technical upgrades are no longer governed specifically by Coinbase, but instead by the OP community, if you like. And then the next big piece of that roadmap is moving away from a single sequencer and moving into a world where there are multiple different parties all coming together to sequence transactions, not just on Base, but on all Superchain chains.
Definitely. In that world, in that future, what role would Coinbase play in this decentralized version of Base?
We will be essentially distribution and core development. And the hope is that we're not the only people developing. The hope is that we're building in community and that inspires people to actively participate and actively lean in. But we will, irrespective, continue to build, both for Base, but also for the broader Superchain, and help decentralize and improve security there. And we will continue to pull people in. That's our primary role. We want to enable builders, and we want to provide distribution, and we want to continue to provide tooling that makes it significantly easier for both users to engage, but also builders to build.
One thing that you mentioned earlier in this conversation is this concept of in the future, there will be general purpose rollups, there will be app specific rollups. In your view, why would an application want to build on, or when would they choose, maybe is the right way of framing it, to build in a general purpose environment such as Base versus launch their rollup? And do you think that we'll see maybe in the future general purpose rollups being a testing ground, and then after a certain point when they've achieved some level of growth, they transition to being an app specific rollup? How do you think about that?
I think you nailed it there. I think the likely path of development for the majority of use cases is going to be start in a shared environment, build on a Base or an Optimism mainnet or some chain that makes sense, gives you the reliable, secure block space that you're looking for. And then as you grow and as you get product market fit and as demand increases, the economics are going to start swinging in our direction. So rather than being incentivized to build in this shared environment where it's just, there's a lot less friction for you to get up and running, you're going to be incentivized to kind of own the infrastructure. And you're going to want to move using a AWS or GCP type analogy. You're going to want to move from the shared services up to your own dedicated hardware. In this case, running your own chain. And so part of the draw for OP Stack is that there's a well-trodden path to enable that. Someone can come, they can build on Base, and they can get to scale. And then when it makes sense for them, they can spin out and start with their own individual deployment of OP Stack. Now, that's not going to be the slickest process in the world. There's work to do there to make that really slick. But it's going to be significantly easier to go from Base to OP Stack than it is to go from I've started building in some chain and now I want to build something completely new. You're using the same technology, and so the migration will be significantly simpler.
I want to talk a little bit about the traction that Base has seen in the last 2.5, 3 months since launching. Can you talk about what metrics you guys are looking at? What has traction looked like so far?
It's been an incredible launch. There's an insane amount of work still to do. The Onchain summer was successful. It drove a ton of content on chain, which has captured a ton of eyeballs and resulted in a lot of people engaging, in a lot of cases for the first time, which is amazing to see. We are pretty much tracking what you'd expect. We're tracking number of users. We're tracking number of builders. Super important for us that we have as many builders as possible actively building. We're tracking the total value, if you like, on chain. And we're tracking the number of transactions because for us, we take a small margin on every transaction, and that's what funds the development of everything that we're talking about here. That's the revenue driver, if you like. So it's all about bringing more users on chain, bringing more assets on chain, and giving builders a captive audience to build applications for.
So I have a couple of follow-up questions. One being, do you have a sense for what is the breakdown of existing crypto users and existing crypto builders versus net new crypto users and net new builders that are on chain for the first time via Base?
Loosely, but not in enough detail for me to really get into the nitty-gritty here. I think taking a step back, broadly speaking, the vast majority of activity on layer 2s today is existing crypto users. And the reason for that is just a bit of a pain in the ass to use this stuff still. There's a ton of effort going into making it significantly easier. We talked about a bunch of this stuff, things like MPC and account abstraction, things like Coinbase just leaning in and supporting these networks so that users can get directly into them quite quickly. But the reality of the situation is that it's only in the past 6 to 12 months that a lot of this stuff has started becoming available. And so we're not there yet. We don't have tons and tons of net new users. But the thing that seems to be driving the most net new users is the creator side and the social side. Those are the kind of areas where we're seeing the most adoption from net new, this is my first address, or this is my first time transacting on chain, clean wallet, whatever you want to count it as. And that's exciting. It's really cool. So the next wave of friendtechs and of creator platforms are very likely to continue that trend. And that's what we're hoping to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Another comment I wanted to make was I think that Jesse shared, going back to this question around traction, I think Jesse shared this chart showing the number of transactions on L2. And I don't know if it was specific to Base or just L2s more broadly versus L1 Ethereum. And I just remember seeing that chart like a year ago and it was completely flipped. And it's really exciting to see so many people building on L2s and so many users onboarding onto L2s, and actually shows that L2s are seeing product market fit and people are just resonating with lower, more consistent fees and just a much faster, better user experience.
That's what it's all about. Absolutely. And the chart you're talking about, it shows Ethereum essentially flatlining in terms of activity. And the reason for that is not negative in any way, shape, or form. It's just that Ethereum is essentially at capacity. And when we say at capacity, obviously there is tons of headroom, but the headroom requires the gas costs to go absolutely mental. And we saw during the last kind of DeFi summer, I say the last DeFi summer, I guess it's been the only real DeFi summer, but during DeFi summer, I remember doing a ton of different transactions where I was paying $200, $300, $400 just to approve a token, which is one of the least gas intensive exercises you can have. Actually doing a swap could be $1,200. We can't get back to that point. It just doesn't make sense. It's not going to scale. It's not going to work. And so that chart shows Ethereum being relatively stable and at capacity. I think we can loosely use that term. And layer 2 is just in this up and to the right curve. And I think we're going to continue to see that as more and more layer 2s come online and as more and more dApps with good utility drive more and more users on chain. And Ethereum benefits massively because all of this is rolling back up and publishing to layer 1. We're all in the same EVM environment. We're all building in community. This is not about layer 2 trying to compete or take away from. It's very much some of the sharpest builders in the space coming together to collectively scale Ethereum. And that's super exciting.
Another thing you mentioned is Onchain Summer, which was a campaign that you guys ran, I think, shortly after Base launched to try and just have opportunities, fun opportunities for people to participate on chain. Can you talk a little bit about how you thought about designing that? What were some of the exciting pieces of it? What was surprising maybe as a result of Onchain Summer? And how did that drive activity and adoption?
For sure. And for anyone unaware, Onchain Summer was like a miniature festival style celebration. And the idea was to bring on-chain culture and art and music and gaming and all these kind of things together to show what's possible and just celebrate what's available and what's possible. So we partnered with 20 plus different creators and marketplaces to bring cool content from a variety of different verticals into onchainsummer.xyz, where every day for 3 and a bit weeks, we had a drop. And it was done by people like Coca-Cola, people like Another Block, and people like Iskra and Friends with Benefits, and tons of different groups across the space. And it went really well. I think we had somewhere in the region of 270 odd thousand individual unique wallets participating in the daily mint, being excited and collecting some of the work from each of these people. And I think in total, we ended up with about 700-ish thousand minted. So great way to start, great way to demonstrate what's possible on chain and show that crypto isn't just about speculation. I think this is really important for the conversation that's currently happening on the Hill. One of the things that we get asked the most is why should we provide real detailed regulation for an industry that's just fueled by nothing more than speculation? And so I've probably said the word utility about 1 million times when we've been chatting, but it's super important that we really drive cool, useful things, because that means that we can, with a straight face, in a credible way, say, no, we need real regulation for the crypto space because we are empowering creators and we're enabling people to engage in a more meaningful way. And we're powering the next generation of loyalty programs, and we're enabling cross-border payments in a significantly slicker, much more affordable way. And we're providing access to next-gen products. And having an ability to point to real utility is massively important for that entire effort. So On-Chain Summer for me was a massive success. It's something that we will iterate and improve upon and try and do again and pull even more different builders and creators into the space. But yeah, it was a ton of fun. And I think broadly, people enjoyed it.
Absolutely. I thought it was a really fun way to get people involved and transacting on chain. And I think it was one of those things that showed crypto and non-crypto users that there is a way to have fun on chain, and that being on chain can be really lighthearted and fun and exciting. So I love that. And yeah, to your point, I think showcasing more use cases that are non-speculative and showcasing use cases where operating on public blockchain networks is providing real value to a number of different stakeholders around the world is definitely very important. So it's awesome to see that. And I'm excited to continue to see that, those kinds of use cases be proven out. Well, Rowan, I think we're at our time. It's been such a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much for going in a winding direction that I took this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
It's been a ton of fun. Thank you very much. And look forward to speaking to you again. Take care.
Thanks for listening to another episode of On the Brink with Castle Island. To find out more about Castle Island, visit castleisland.vc. To listen to all of our podcast episodes, please go to onthebrink-podcast.com or just click on the tab in our website. Thanks for listening.